Welcome once again to Lehto's Law. Here's Steve Lehto.
The other day I was talking about lawsuits, and I said, yeah, it reminds me of the Home Depot 2x4 lawsuit. And I said, I wonder what ever happened to that lawsuit. And then I moved on, as I so often do. And several people sent me notes and said, hey, Steve, check it out. It looks like those lawsuits involving the lumber were dismissed. And it may have only been one lawsuit, but actually there were several issues I want to talk about now. So forgive my use of the plural because there actually were more than one lawsuit involving the dimensions of lumber. And this is the kind of thing, and so once in a while, when I tell people that I'm an attorney, they go, oh, and they want to talk about frivolous lawsuits. And yeah, there are frivolous lawsuits out there. And what defines frivolity in the legal system is probably a little different than what the average person thinks, because a lot of people think that a lawsuit like this would be frivolous. And now, I personally understand the point of the lawsuit. I would not have filed this myself. So if someone came into my office and, Steve, I'm very, very upset because here's what happened. I went into a Home Depot or a Lowe's or someplace that sells lumber, and I bought a stack of 2x4s. When I got them home, I asked myself, 2x4. And I measured the lumber, and it turns out a 2x4 is smaller than 2 inches one way and smaller than 4 inches the other way. Therefore, it's not really a 2x4, is it? Well, 2x4 is a term of art. It's a term of art. Ask any carpenter what a 2x4 is. They go, yeah, it's a piece of lumber. And they'll give you the dimensions if you ask them. But a lot of them are used in construction. 2x4s are very, very commonly used. If you've ever built a house or a garage or anything, quite often they'll bring those things out by the truckload. I mean, gigantic bundles of them, and they just disappear into the building. The building process, okay? But 2x4s often were not 2x4 inches. So one lawsuit was filed back in, I believe, 2017. But as I was researching this, because I had several people say, by the way, see, that lawsuit got dismissed. You should know about that. Well, I do now, and I'm going to talk about it. But interestingly, while I was researching that, I found a lawsuit that was successful a few years earlier, which may have been what inspired someone to file this lawsuit. So this story here is from 2018. The headline is, lawsuit saying Home Depot tricks buyers of 4x4 lumber is deep sixed. So 4x4, 2x4, all that kind of stuff, talking about the dimensions of the lumber. They had complained about both the 4x4s and the 2x4s. Jonathan Stemple wrote this version of the story talking about the dismissal for Reuters. A federal judge dismissed the lawsuit accusing Home Depot of deceiving shoppers about the size of its 4x4 lumber. I believe there was actually a lawsuit that addressed 2x4s also, but U.S. District Judge in Chicago rejected the plaintiff's claim that the largest U.S. home improvement retailer should be held liable for selling lumber as 4 inches thick by 4 inches wide when the dimensions were actually 3.5 inches by 3.5 inches. While not persuaded by the Home Depot argument that the lumber's actual size was common knowledge, the judge said its labels reading 4x4-6 would not have misled consumers because they didn't contain measurements. It just had a number 4x4, and it didn't have the little inch marks next to it. So the judge says that Home Depot never expressly represented the lumber actually measuring 4 inches by 4 inches. Now, the plaintiff argued that the label was potentially confusing, and the dismissal was without prejudice, meaning the plaintiff could refile the proposed class action, which sought unspecified damages, but his lawyers did not immediately respond to comment, and I believe they just dropped it. A spokesperson for Home Depot said, we're glad to have resolved the issue. In seeking a dismissal, Home Depot said the ruling for this case, if it had gone the other way, would ignore nearly a century of standardization and disturb an entire industry's reliance on these lumber names. So a similar lawsuit was dismissed earlier against Menards with the same argument. That judge found that no reasonable consumer would think that the labels showed the exact dimensions of the lumber. So you might say, okay, Steve, that makes complete sense. I understand that. Because one of the things you have to understand is, if I'm selling you a 2x4 and you have it in your hands, you can see how big it is. Now, I suppose you're going to say, but Steve, unless you have a tape measure, you're not going to miss a half an inch or a quarter of an inch or whatever it might be, depending on the lumber. Yeah. But ask anybody what are the dimensions of a 2x4, and most are going to say, oh, it's less than 2 and it's less by 4. So while looking into this story, I encountered a story from a few years earlier. In 2014, Lowe's had been accused by California, the state, of mislabeling 2x4s. And here, Lowe's lost. That is, they wound up paying. But I believe they actually just settled the case. So Lowe's decided not to fight it. And I wonder now if they had fought it, if they would have won. But the difference here is that it was the state of California seeking to enforce weights and measures. And many states have got bureaus of weights and measures that oversee how commerce is conducted with things that are measured and weighed. And if you study consumer protection laws and the concept of consumer protection, it goes way back, and it began with weights and measures. Think about a time when, like say in the 1600s, when you'd go to the county fair and you'd buy your grain, and you'd walk up to a vendor, a merchant, and you go, I want a bushel of grain. And they measure something out, and they go, there you go, that's a bushel. Is that a real bushel? How much is a bushel? It was not uncommon that you simply had to trust that the vendor was using the proper measure. And measurements varied from place to place. One town might have a bushel that's different than the next town over, or their foot or their yard might be different. Those things were not standardized at a national level. There's a fascinating book called The Measure of All Things about the history of the metric system. But to get there, the guy tells a story leading up to it of all the different problems they had with weights and measures preceding that. So you had to get a standardized foot, a standardized yard, a standardized bushel. And so many places now still have these. And the most likely place that you're going to encounter it is next time you pump gas. Look at your gas pump, and somewhere on it in most states is a sticker that says when it was last inspected. Because how would you know if that thing just dispensed 10 gallons or not? You buy 10 gallons of gasoline, you don't even see it. Back in the old days, at least you could see it in the pump and watch it run into your car. Not anymore. So how do you know? So once in a while, they go out and they inspect the pumps. They put the inspection stickers on there, and they often have a phone number that says, if you think this pump is off, let us know. So the weights and measures people in California decided that Lowe's was being problematic. And they said that the lawsuit says, Lowe's unlawfully advertised structural dimensional building products for sale. Under the terms of the settlement, the retailer will have to correct its misleading descriptions from its 2x4s and other dimensional materials, or remove the non-compliant materials from its shelves. So the lumber measurement lawsuit was filed in response to concerns from local weights and measures department representatives in California who found that the common product measurements did not match up with the dimensions. For example, a 2x4 piece of lumber did not actually measure 2x4. Instead, it measured 1.5 by 3.5 inches. And there's a whole story behind that, because when they cut the lumber and then they finish the lumber and they cure the lumber, it winds up being that dimension. Could they make it wind up being 2x4? Yes, they could. But it would change everything, including how much the stuff costs. So the court documents indicate that Lowe's was ordered to pay nearly $1.5 million in civil penalties and legal costs, as well as an additional $150,000 to be used to fund other consumer protection efforts. Lowe's will also be required to display actual dimensions next to the commonly used measurements and product descriptions. So in other words, if it's going to say 2x4, it's got to say actual dimensions, 1.5 by 3.5 inches. A district attorney said consumers should expect when making product purchases that retailers are providing accurate information, especially when misinformation could adversely affect building projects that more often than not rely on precise measurements. No one's going to argue and say that the 2x4s commonly measured at 1.5 by 3.5, no one's going to argue those are inadequate for the job. No one's going to argue that. They've been using those in building for some time, and they still are. They've simply relabeled them. Under the terms of the settlement, Lowe's is subject to an injunction prohibiting it from selling 2x4s in less quantity than represented and from labeling the product that misrepresents the product's actual dimensions. Common descriptions must be followed by actual dimensions, and the dimensions must use abbreviations such as those for inch, foot, or yard instead of symbols such as or when providing measurements. The Lowe's settlement will affect the in-store signage of 100 Lowe's stores in California. So that was a California case brought under California law by the state of California on behalf of consumers, but they settled it and they agreed to stop mislabeling their 2x4s. But it really meant that they're going to say, okay, this is a 2x4, and they could spell it out, TWO space BY space FOUR, and then put beneath it actual dimensions and put those in, and they're fine. And that should settle the problem. But getting back to the Home Depot lawsuit, the court said, well, this shouldn't actually confuse anybody because everyone knows what this means. But it's crazy. It's crazy. So like I said, I would never have brought the lawsuit. But I also do understand that having them label these things more accurately might be nice, but is it necessary? So I actually bought some 2x4s a week ago. Didn't even think about it because, what you're using them for, a 2x4 will do it, and a 2x4 will do it, even if it is 1.5 by 3.5. So there you go. So that is the clarification, I hope, on the 2x4 lawsuit involving Home Depot, but also one involving Lowe's from a few years earlier in California. Questions or comments, put them below. Otherwise, talk to you later. Bye-bye.
Thank you for watching Lehto's Law. The difference between stupidity and genius is that genius has its limits.